Well, how did you become associated and get involved ultimately with Epstein Justice?
Well, actually, the issue was brought to my attention by one of my adult children who lives in Omaha, Nebraska, and came to me and said, have you heard about the Franklin scandal? And the Franklin scandal was a child trafficking network that was run out of Omaha, Nebraska in the 80s and early 90s and is still very well known in Omaha, Nebraska. In fact, I was in Omaha, Nebraska in March of last year having lunch with a friend. This subject came up. I was telling them what I was doing with my life. I'm involved in this and I got involved through the Franklin scandal. And our server said, "Hey, I grew up on the streets around here, and this is well known that this was something you had to look out for as a child on the streets of Omaha was be careful, you might get child trafficked." Now, this was in 2023 that somebody came up and approached me and discussed this with me at a diner. So it's a situation that was well known in Omaha, Nebraska. And the person who broke that story wide open is investigative journalist Nick Bryant. And he wrote a book called The Franklin Scandal. It's available for any of your listeners who would like to read it. It's nickbryantnyc.com. You can order that book and others. He's a terrific journalist. So my son and I actually reached out to Nick Bryant because I read The Franklin Scandal and I was absolutely aghast at how the federal government had abused its power to punish and silence the victims in that case. And I wanted to find out kind of how he had come across the story and so forth. And in the course of those conversations, he and I became friends. And Nick said to me, "Well, that was certainly a terrible case of abuse of power. But have you investigated Jeffrey Epstein at all?" And I said, "Well, no, I really hadn't." And he began to fill me in on that situation. And of course, I did then began researching myself, looked at hundreds of news articles, and couldn't understand for myself. It seemed obvious to me that here was a guy that ran in the highest circles of government power and financial power. He knew everybody at a high level in America and many people around the world. And yet somehow, as the case unfolded, the American people and people all around the world were led to believe that he and Ghislaine Maxwell were the only people who knew or were involved in his horrific crimes. And I found that to be incredible. In fact, I still find it to be unbelievable. And that's one of the reasons why I urged Nick Bryant to form Epstein Justice as a nonprofit organization so that he could have the resources necessary to continue to bring attention to this issue and raise the kind of public awareness that's going to be necessary to make the changes that are necessary in order to have real accountability for these unimaginable crimes.
You mentioned the Franklin case, and it was an FBI agent, Ted Gunderson, I think, who also tried to blow the whistle on that. Whatever happened to Gunderson, and just the what was the result of the investigation?
The result of the investigation in the Franklin scandal is that the child sex trafficking ring that was run out of Omaha, Nebraska was completely covered up by the federal government. There have been no prosecutions, I mean, no substantial prosecutions of those crimes to this very day. Now, the one of the primary players in that particular situation, Larry King, was sentenced for financial crimes, but he wasn't sentenced for his primary role in the trafficking of children out of Omaha, Nebraska to powerful people all across the country. And and one of the primary victims in that case, Alicia Owen, who is also an associate director of Epstein Justice, was sentenced to prison for perjury for coming forward with her true tale of victimization, and as a result of that, spent several years in prison and was really, if you want to get right down to it, a political prisoner. Certainly, the evidence that she was a liar is non-existent. She's simply not one. But this is the issue when you're talking about child sex trafficking. Yes, the witnesses are inherently unreliable in the sense that they're children. They've been abused. We all know that when you study human memory, it can be manipulated for better or worse. So you have to, as a prosecutor, to look at the totality of the evidence, not look at any one single individual victim. Yes, one victim. And by the way, you mentioned I was a diversity and equity trainer for the Air Force. I was also an investigator of equal opportunity and sexual harassment complaints. And yes, one victim comes forward, it can become a case of word on word. But in the case of not only the Franklin scandal, but obviously the Epstein case, you had hundreds of victims coming forward. And so it's not a question of one person's word against another person's word. You have dozens and dozens of witnesses whose experiences can be bounced off one another and bounced off of available facts. And that hasn't been done, as far as I can tell. I'm looking for the investigation into the Epstein situation. I'm not seeing an investigation. If there's been one, then release the results. And don't tell me that the only two people involved were Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, because that's simply not a believable position.
In any other case, one would expect the names of clients, co-conspirators, to be published immediately, or if not immediately, soon after criminal proceedings and so forth. This is unprecedented. Well, not exactly. I mean, you mentioned the Franklin case, but why do you suspect we're not getting the names? Does this suggest that this sex trafficking operation was orchestrated at the highest levels of the government?
Well, I guess what I would say to that, Richard, is that I don't really know. And this is why we at Epstein Justice are advocating that every American write their member of Congress and urge a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to truly investigate not just this crime, but the whole underlying fabric of child sex trafficking that exists in America. Somehow it's okay in America to exploit children for profit, and to exploit the sexuality of children for profit. And that's wrong. And we have to, as a society, look at all of the causes and conditions, and frankly, all of the outcomes that have taken place as a result of that underlying cultural proclivity. And beyond that, though, to answer your question directly, we've seen the names come out. We're supposed to believe that former President Trump, former President Clinton, Bill Gates, Alan Dershowitz, and a host of other celebrities and high rollers saw this happening all around them, but couldn't connect the dots and or weren't participating. Well, that just isn't believable. Look, I have friends. And the people that I spend time with and hang out with and fly on their private planes with, though I've never done that, but supposing I did, I mean, I would have some idea about what these people were up to in their private lives. And I would, by my association with those people, I would be indicating that I approve of it, even if I weren't taking part in it directly. But if I hang out with somebody for a long time, we become like the people we hang out with. This is one of the reasons it is so unbelievable. When you look at, for example, even the Black Book that was published by Nick Bryant on Gawker in 2012, of all of the friends and associates of Jeffrey Epstein, all of the numbers that he had in his Black Book. Now, admittedly, Epstein was a person who loved to have the illusion of power, influence, and intelligence, especially. He loved to be perceived as a smart guy. But at the end of the day, you can't tell me that the people that associated with him willingly, again and again, even after his conviction for sex crime, that those people didn't understand who he was. And why would you hang around with that kind of person unless you not only approved, but were willing to participate in that sort of activity? So we know the names. What we don't know is what their actual level of participation is or was. And that is why an investigation, a true investigation, is absolutely necessary for closure for the American people.
One of the victims who testified against Ghislaine Maxwell died under rather mysterious circumstances. Carolyn Andriano. She passed away, I believe, in October of 2023. She testified in May in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. Have you heard any they ruled it an accidental overdose, although, I mean, it does sound suspicious given that she was very, you know, talking with friends and family, very optimistic about her future plans, you know, starting a new life and so forth. Do you have any updates on the Adriano case, and what are your thoughts about her mysterious death?
I don't have any particular updates. I'm not an investigator. I'm urging the investigators to investigate. But that all being said, there's whenever you take a look at a case like this, there's always a string of mysterious and unexplained deaths. If you look at the Franklin scandal, for example, the primary private investigator that was working on uncovering some of the connections between the rich and powerful and those who were actually doing the child sex trafficking in Omaha, his plane blew up. And he was an experienced pilot. There was no reason for his plane to explode in midair, but it did. And there was a host of unexplained deaths in the Epstein case as well, starting, of course, with Jeffrey Epstein. You know, his own brother does not believe, Mark Epstein does not believe that Jeffrey Epstein took his own life. I don't know whether or not Jeffrey Epstein took his own life. What I know for sure, and I don't know, Richard, if you've read the Bureau of Prisons report on his suicide or his death. I like to call it his death. I'm not convinced, as are millions of Americans not convinced, that it was in fact a suicide. I don't really know. What I do know is that after reading that report, which of course, like most government reports investigating themselves, said, well, look, we've looked at everything ourselves and we ourselves have found nothing wrong. Although they found incompetence and so forth. No, we didn't find any evidence that there was some sort of conspiracy. But what did happen, and this is kind of undisputed, is that they established conditions that allowed Jeffrey Epstein to take his own life if that's what he wanted to do. There's no question that those conditions existed. The Bureau of Prisons, federal law enforcement, put him in an environment where it was totally up to him if he wanted to take his own life or not. Now, oh, by the way, he had one call right before his death that was unrecorded, unregistered. We don't know who it was to. We don't know what was said. But what we do know is the next day he was dead. Now, the report doesn't really address any of those kinds of issues and suggests that it was just rank incompetence all the way down the line. But here you have the most wanted criminal in America, the most notorious child sex trafficker in history. And I know one thing, having worked at a high level of government for a while, that is, high level people get high level attention. And so why wasn't there any sort of attention paid to him? All I know for sure, Richard, is that there remain more questions than answers, and the American people have a right to know the truth. But the other side of the coin is that we also have a long history in America, and I'm a military historian. My master's degree is in military history. And so we have a long history in America of covering up our own mistakes and failing to admit, and then later requiring investigations to get at the truth.
I mean, I've looked at the evidence, and it seems to me quite clear. And I think the preponderance of evidence suggests that it was not suicide; that he was in fact murdered. Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. Why didn't she name names? Why wasn't she asked to name names?
These are questions that demand answers, Richard. That's a great question. It's a question that I share with you. Now, I could speculate as to why that is, but the reality is that if you take a look at some of the other unanswered questions, here's another good question. Why is it, for example, we know that when Jeffrey Epstein's residences were raided in New York and in Palm Beach and in Little St. James Island, that there was recording equipment in those residences. And in fact, there were entire bags full of CDs hauled out of the New York residence. What was on those CDs? Who was on those CDs? Where are those tapes? What was on them? And we don't know the answers to those questions because that detail, that information has never been disclosed. But if you look at why someone like that would have all of his residences in a position to record incriminating evidence, well, one can only reach the conclusion that he had a use for that information, he being Jeffrey Epstein. And what seems reasonable is that in the high moving circle of people that he worked in, that he wanted to have something on them. And he probably did have something on them, not for his own personal amusement, but it's been suggested, and it was suggested, in fact, according to journalist Vicky Ward, that it was that he was an intelligence asset. It was suggested that he was an intelligence asset by no less than Alex Acosta, the former U.S. Labor Secretary under President Trump. According to Ward, Acosta, when he was being vetted for the position of Labor Secretary in the Trump administration, was asked about his handling of the Epstein case, where he let him off with basically a slap on the wrist. And he said, well, I didn't worry about it. I was told from on high that it was above my pay grade and he was an intelligence asset. Did he actually say that? He's never denied it. But has he ever been asked about this matter? As far as I know, he's never even been asked if that's a true statement or if the reporter was making it up, although I would think he would sue her for defamation if she was making that up. So there's significant evidence that this was, frankly, an intelligence operation, that the entire child sex trafficking ring was run by U.S. intelligence or with the complicity of U.S. intelligence. And you say, well, that's incredible. Why would a U.S. intelligence agency commit horrific crimes like that or allow them to be committed? And yet, we know that historically speaking, the Central Intelligence Agency has committed any number of horrible crimes, from targeted assassinations to feeding its own citizens psychedelics without their knowledge. And in fact, as you well know, they enlisted under the program MK Ultra a prominent Canadian psychiatrist in that effort as well. And that's been well documented by the CBC. So the CIA and other intelligence agencies in the United States, of which there are many, are simply not appropriately given the right congressional oversight. We really don't know what they're up to, because how could we? And if you have time, Richard, I could tell you a little bit about what's involved in congressional oversight. And we could get to that when it's appropriate.
Well, we can, because I was going to ask you. I mean, it would seem to be a pretty simple matter to subpoena, once again, FBI Director Christopher Wray and ask him some simple questions. Are you in possession of recording equipment and videotapes and cassette tapes and so forth, that were seized from Jeffrey Epstein's properties? That's a pretty simple question. Are you in possession of that material? Have you viewed that material? Pretty simple questions that just remain not only unanswered, but not even asked, as you point out.
Well, and that's an excellent point. I mean, but as it regards, for example, who was behind this operation, there's a number of secrets in government that, in fact, the American government is so riddled with secrecy, and our classification system is so rigid and difficult to penetrate that, for example, and this happened to me several times, I would escort a 4-star general or a service secretary to meet with a United States senator. These two people, either the 4-star general or the service secretary, would go into a secure compartmentalized information facility, or a SCIF, just those two, no staffers, certainly not me, and no other congressional staffers allowed, just the senator and the official from the executive branch. Those two people would exchange information. Or what would happen is the senator would be told the way it is by the 4-star general or the service secretary. Imagine you're a member of Congress. You have no way to vet the information you're being provided because it's top secret. You can't ask any questions about it. You can't even have any of your staffers who might have more expertise than you, and in fact will probably have more expertise than you on this particular subject. You can't even have them in the room. And you can't even disclose to them what it is you've been told. Now, how is it that Congress can conduct any meaningful oversight under that framework? And the answer is they can't. So to a large extent, the executive branch of the federal government is, to a very large degree, unaccountable to the branch, to Congress, to the congressional branch. And that's an enormous problem in democratic governance, as you can imagine. Now, and we're talking about now, from my perspective, my own personal experience, the Department of Defense, okay? And we had some desire, at least, to be marginally cooperative because we wanted the money. the intelligence agencies have some interest also because they need money from Congress. But at the end of the day, there's the idea that our congressional oversight function is functioning appropriately or as the founders intended. Well, it's just not happening. And thus, we see, that's been called the deep state. I don't think that's a fair description. What I would say is we have unaccountable people and organizations in the executive branch who lack the requisite congressional oversight that the founders intended, allowing these branches and individuals to conduct operations that are completely unknown to the American people and therefore are completely without oversight. And as a result, you get things, for example, like the CIA running cocaine in the United States to fund arms deals. You have Iran-Contra, and potentially you have an intelligence honeypot operation run by a financier that emerged from nowhere and appears to have made his living blackmailing. I don't know if any of those things happened, but I would sure like somebody to ask.
Yeah, likewise. Well, you mentioned lack of oversight. And so, for example, the CIA, if they're running drugs, they're running guns, they're running a child sex trafficking operation, maybe, they don't need, they have their own budget, it would appear, a black budget. So they don't feel the need for any, to go cap in hand to Congress for their budgets, I suppose. Can you just kind of spell it out for my listeners, how such a honeypot operation would operate, and for example, how the various leaders would be blackmailed and so forth?
Absolutely. And it's not complicated. So, for example, the kinds of things that Jeffrey Epstein is into. He's into young girls, right? And you associate yourself with him, and he makes available to you young girls, and you take advantage of that. While you're taking advantage of that, you're being filmed. You don't know you're being filmed, or you wouldn't do it, but nevertheless, he's filming you. Afterwards, it doesn't really matter even if he films you or not. You know that he knows that you engage in that kind of behavior. Now, you do something he doesn't like, or more to the point, he suggests you do something that he would like, or he'd like some piece of information. He's got something on you. And now he can use that information that he has on you to influence you, to make you do something, to make you not do something that you otherwise would do. He has now control and power over you because he has access to a secret that you don't want disclosed. And this is why we see, and this is one of the indications, if you will, that this is an enormous cover-up. Why do we have the federal government closing ranks around all of these rich and powerful people who say, we didn't do anything wrong? Well, I guess if you say so. I mean, that seems to be the response of the federal government. And the whole thing smells to high heaven. And the average American knows this, Richard. This is why there continues to be such outrage about this case, because it does not pass the smell test, and how the federal government has handled the investigation, or lack thereof, also doesn't pass the smell test. Listen, if all of the people associated with Epstein Justice, if all of the people associated with Epstein's crimes who have escaped justice, if all of those people are indeed innocent, then why not disclose the result of an investigation into that shows that information? I guess the answer is, you could argue, well, they're innocent until proven guilty. Well, that's fine, but at least there must be some kind of investigation that helps clear their name. Right now, as far as I'm concerned, all of the people who ever emerged in Epstein's black book are under a black cloud. And until there's some sort of positive investigation into what he was actually up to, who put him up to it, and what and why, and those answers are publicly disclosed, all of the people who are ever associated with Epstein Justice will remain under suspicion.